Hey everyone. In case you don't know me, my name is Tim Foskett. I'm employed a couple of days a week as the General Secretary of the Fellowship of Congregational Churches. And I just wanted to spend a little bit of time, a few seconds really, just announcing something that we're really excited about in some of the leadership of the Fellowship of Congregational Churches. Basically, and if you clicked on this, you might even guess what we're talking about. Basically, we're going to be launching a regular video blog / podcast / YouTube video, basically detailing life as and part of the Fellowship of Congregational Churches. Now you may be asking why? Why are we doing this? What's the purpose of this? Well, I think we have three key reasons that I think we're going to be doing this and going to be putting some resource and some time and some energy and some effort into doing this. The first is basically just community. The reality is the Congregational Church in Australia has undergone a lot of changes in the past 5-10 years. There's a lot of people floating around who are pastoring our churches, who are leading our churches, who are attending our churches, who we simply don't know. And so we think this is a really good way for us to get to know each other, to introduce each other, to see where our strengths are and our passions in ministry, and ways that we can be encouraging and praying for one another, ways that we can be telling stories of successes, but also trials and hardships, ways that we can be encouraging one another as we try and work within this wonderful network of churches. That's the first thing. The second thing is training. Now, our plan is to really pick a few really key practical areas of pastoral ministry or church leadership, and to do sort of sessions and online workshops and online training on those specific areas. And so we're going to make this as practical and as useful as possible. And the third thing is more of a bigger picture thing for us as a group of churches and us as a network of churches is vision. Number 3, vision. Where are we going in the future? What do we want to see happen in our group of churches? What are we excited about? What are our dreams pointing us to? Where is God taking us as a group of churches? We're going to share initiatives and ideas and going to get speakers in and people who can speak into rejuvenation and replanting and bringing new life to this wonderful network of churches, particularly relevant to the incredible history from which we came. Now, basically, as we launch this, the idea is to do one every kind of 2 or 3 weeks, but we are going to ask you to be a little bit patient with us. We're still working out the technology. We're still working out how we're going to actually work within this new medium. We're still working out what this looks like, particularly those of us who work 2 jobs or have other commitments, how we're going to pull this off. So bear with us, but we're really excited, and we're going to ask you to click and subscribe and to watch and to listen in and to be part of it as well, because it's not just for us, it's for you as well. And by all means, feel free to give me some feedback as we push into this. Anyway, we have our first session now. I'm going to hand over to myself and to Michael as we talk a little bit about the history of Congregational Church and some of our practice as well. So hopefully you get a lot out of it. But like I said, feel free to flick me an email or get in touch. Look forward to hearing from you. Hey everyone, we're super stoked to be here for our first FCC podcast. Bear with us, we're still working out finer details about name and all that sort of stuff. Hopefully by the time you're getting getting this, you'll be starting to see some of those details, and the product will be a bit more streamlined and a bit more perfected as we go along. But I think it's really appropriate for me to introduce my guest, or someone I'm sure you're familiar with, Michael Hunt. He's the president of the Fellowship of Congregational Churches. Hi, Michael.
Hey, Tim. Great to be here with you.
Thanks, Michael. As I sort of highlighted in my intro, we're going to spend some time talking about what it means to be the Congregational Church in 2021. Thinking about our practice, thinking about our theology, thinking about ways of moving forward. But I think a big part of that is thinking about also our history, things that have come before this time in our kind of history, and why that's important for us to reflect on now. So, Michael, if I was to ask you, and in some ways we're all experts on congregationalism, but maybe you're more of an expert than I am, why does congregationalism exist? Can you give us a brief sort of ballpark as to why this movement began in the first place, be it in Australia or England or wherever it was? Why did the FCC start, or why did the congregational movement more specifically start?
Well, I think there's a couple of ways we can answer that question. Why does congregationalism exist here in Australia? Well, when the colonies came, when the colonies were started here in Australia, there was a desire for a Christian presence, a Protestant presence. And as a result of congregational missionary endeavours in the South Seas, those missionaries came and resided here in Australia. And Australia's Protestant landscape has richness to it because of Congregationalist involvement here in Australia. Now, that, of course, has changed over the years, and particularly with the creation of the Uniting Church and many of the Congregational Union churches going into that. But one, here in Australia, Congregationalists finds its roots going back to even the early days of the colonies. Previous to that, Congregationalism was, as we know it in its modern sense, a formation of the work of the Puritans. So in the 16th century, or 1600s, I should say, in England, there was, of course, a tension between those who were deemed to be conformists to polity, as it was in that day, and nonconformists. And sometimes the nonconformists were called separatists. And particularly during that time when the UK, England, was its own nation, no longer under a monarchy in the days of Cromwell. The Puritans had a much greater emphasis or involvement over the spiritual landscape, and Congregationalism came birthed out of that as a response of not wanting being told by national authorities about how to run their churches. So that separation of church and state. But I think more importantly, and moving the historical side of where Congregationalism in Australia comes from, and when historical Congregationalism comes from, is Congregationalism holds a really high place for the priesthood of all believers. It basically finds its roots in this theological precept. It basically is holding high that together, as God's people, we're involved in the running and the governance of the church.
So obviously that would contrast to, say, a Presbyterian church or even an Anglican church, which are really big in our context here in Sydney, where you might have a rector or a presbyter or someone who's much more involved in making decisions and making leadership calls. How then would, say, Congregationalism or a form of Congregationalism contradict or even challenge that? So how are we different from, say, an Anglican church down the road or a Presbyterian church down the road?
Well, I think on the one hand, there's a major similarity between all of us. We all would say we hold Christ as the head of the church. And what then happens is at the local level, at the governance level, what happens every Sunday when the church gathers together, that happens by different structures. And so the three main structures that you outline are, one is us as Congregationalists doing it together as a body. And I think there are nuances to that as well, both in the scriptures and historically. The second is the Presbyterian, a section of elders. And then the third is the Episcopalian or the Anglican Church of England form that we're used to here in Australia, and particularly in Sydney, where there are bishops who have authority over that. And I think what we have to say is that when it comes to ecclesiology, even though we differ in terms of governance between, say, the Presbyterians and the Episcopalians or the Church of England, we all hold in common that Christ is the head of the church. What happens is the differences that we hold to or undertake in the local area, whether the local congregation themselves appoints ministers or whether the church governance, such as bishops or a presbytery, appoint ministers to those congregations.
I've experienced Congregationalism because I grew up in a Cong church, even though I've flirted with other churches and other denominations at times. Pretty much my whole experience has been in Congregationalism, and it's something I never really thought about or analysed in any depth. But you're saying there's good theological reasons as to why we do the things we do, and historical reasons as well. So I'm going to play a bit of devil's advocate, though, and come from another angle. If I was to say, and I've heard this in other contexts as well about congregationalism, a criticism sometimes played towards Congregationalists is that it's open democracy. I've heard the phrase kind of big membership in kind of negative terms. So would you nuance that or explain that or counter that in any way as we think about it? Because I think it's a helpful thing. It's a helpful tension in many of our churches, this kind of tension between membership and leadership, both of which I would say are kind of biblical. But how would you see these things playing themselves out in the local church?
Yeah, I think it is helpful to nuance it, and to nuance it for very good scriptural reasons, in that when we say that Christ is the head of the church and that we're all members of the body, it also says to us in the scriptures that the body has different parts for different uses. And there are some who are given to be, pastors and teachers and evangelists who are to use the gifts that God has given them for the building up of the body. And so we do see a place for leadership in this kind of togetherness. In fact, when we go to the book of Acts and we look at the time when there was tension over how goods were being distributed amongst the fellowship there in Jerusalem, it was the widows themselves who took to the apostles the issue that was there before them. And it was their prompting that caused the apostles to reevaluate. And they did that together, not just as one apostle. Peter just didn't go, I'm sick of waiting on tables. Someone else has got to do this for me, kind of stuff. Together they came, and it says, before the Lord, they basically decided that there would be good to appoint deacons for that role. And so we see a kind of hierarchy developing, but still maintaining a togetherness. And it was interesting for me that it was during my college days, the principal of my theological college, who was raised in Sydney Anglicanism, was pointing out this kind of togetherness and saying it to my fellow brothers and sisters who were training for ministry in Episcopalian circles. Hey, you need to work this out, togetherness kind of stuff. This big membership, going back to your original question, the idea of big membership and democracy, on the one hand, it has to be nuanced. It has to be nuanced that the scriptures prescribe a kind of togetherness, or in another way, outline how a togetherness can work. But it also has to be nuanced in the sense that leaders are allowed to be leaders as well. Now, in particular church settings, I think maybe, and in particular seasons and times, leaders will take more of a proactive and more hands-on kind of role. And one of the tensions for me during COVID has seen that this has been one of those seasons here in the local congregation at Revesby where I've had to do that kind of stuff. But there will also be times when we will, and seasons when it will be more pertinent to have everyone kind of involved. And I think on major and big decisions, this is where we land as Congregationalists. When there are big issues with regards to the hiring of staff members, when there are big issues about maybe making large expenditures, we come together and make those decisions. But the worst character of Congregationalism, and I've experienced this, is when every little decision is brought before the membership. Every little thing, and we spend 20, 30 minutes discussing one thing that could just be very simply resolved by one person being given the authority to be able to do that. So, yes, there are I think, some characters about Congregationalism that have been are justifiable. But generally what I found is that when practiced well, Congregationalism does allow for that nuance that we do also see in the scriptures.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I remember when I was studying, because you mentioned when you were at college, I remember when I was at college, people almost spoke in kind of fearful tones of that idea that, we're going to vote on the colour of the toilet paper or the colour of, the pastor's carpet in his bedroom or whatever. And I think that's actually a distortion of Congregationalism, and I think it really depends on the maturity of the church and where the church is at and all these other variables as to how that plays out. But I also remember someone from college saying there's actually, even though congregationalism in Australia is quite small, actually a lot of churches practice congregational principles. And I remember one friend actually even said, oh, a lot of Anglican churches run congregationally. So that's unofficially, but the truth is there are a lot of churches, even though they don't come under the congregational banner per se, are still congregational. So I don't know, are you aware of any of those? I mean, I can think of a really big one, but there might be a few others.
For us as Congregationalists, it's on the door plate, if you like. It's in our logo. This aspect of our ecclesiology is very important. It was interesting when I came to Revesby. I came from a Baptist church background, and someone asked me the question, did I understand what was meant by congregational ecclesiology? And I thought, well, Baptists are actually congregational in their ecclesiology. Church of Christ are congregational in their ecclesiology. Now, that can mean that different local congregations practice that in different ways. A large Baptist church is going to have a very different congregational model than the small rural, Baptist church in a country area kind of thing. And there's historical reasons, but there's also practical reasons for that. And you're right. As I've observed Sydney Anglicans, they'll have an annual meeting where they'll vote people in onto a parish council. And the parish council acts as a kind of plurality of leaders, which Congregationalism aspires to. And even the fact that the parish council can be voted on is kind of like a congregational kind of structure. So, this idea of congregational governance, I want to stress that I think theologically, where we all need to land is that it comes around the idea that the church makes decisions or comes together for the work of ministry. And so we don't say, hey, I'm the expert. I'm the one with all of the skill. I'm the one who knows and understands, and I make all of the calls and decisions here, and no one has any input or say. But rather, in this togetherness, we allow all to have an input and say. And again, I think that actually allows what is, I think, a beautiful picture of the gospel to become seen in God's people, the church. Because think about it. Christ comes down from heaven. He comes together to be with us, to bring us together with him. He doesn't hold on to heaven's glory and power and just kind of say, come on, guys, get your act together, do this, do that. He comes down. He is here with us. He's in the trenches, if you like, in the work that we do. And by his death on the cross, he enables us to come into him as the new humanity, as Paul says in Ephesians. And so this picture, I think, congregational governance, when done well, is the church demonstrating the gospel to the world around it.
That's really, really helpful. And even the way you've really beautifully enunciated that from the Bible really resonates with me, and I think it resonates with a lot of people. Because I know a lot of people, even in independent churches, new church plants, I know Acts 29 churches, people who are past of those churches, which actually basically run them as congregational churches, even though they don't necessarily come under our banner per se. So I think congregationalism is very attractive to a lot of people who are in ministry or looking for churches, that aspect of, we're actually in this together, and there needs to be a mutual accountability in the membership. And that takes me to my next point. Like I can sort of rattle off a few names of people who would very strongly push some sort of congregational governance. So the names that come to my mind are someone like Mark Dever in the US. Even someone like Matt Chandler has some sort of form of congregational governance. John Piper. Are there any people that you have found really helpful? Mark Dever has a book called 12 Marks of a Healthy Church, which in many ways is almost like a congregational second Bible in a lot of ways, because it talks about very strongly congregational polity. Is there any references or books or people that you have found really, really helpful to go to sort of, expand your ideas of what this can look like?
Yeah, look, I mean, Dever's, and I think it's actually 9 Marks of a Healthy Church. Dever's book, 9 Marks of a Healthy Church, was quite instrumental for myself in working through these things. Now, I kind of would land in a slightly different place from Neva on some of these congregational things, but I do see how he articulates these aspects of membership, of plurality of leaders, of covenantal kind of promises, and we haven't really pushed too much into that as well. Deva holds to that strongly, and I think Congregationalism, when it nuances that well, the idea of a covenant between God's people is a really helpful way to understand how we do things together. Look, there are also quite a lot of the Puritans. Look, I find Baxter quite helpful. He kind of, was labelled as a nonconformist. He sort of, argued that he was rather a reluctant kind of nonconformist. I mean, for me, in one sense, I don't want our ecclesiology to be the defining thing of who we are. I do think there is a biblical and a good historical and healthy way, but I think all of our churches would say we want Christ to be seen to be the head of the church, and we want us as the God's people, the body of Christ, to be demonstrating the gospel in the way that we do things. And so some of these Puritan guys really are quite helpful in wanting the church to be the church, not by its structures, but in its gospel work and presentation, in the way that it lives out and cares for one another. See, some structures, both congregational structures and non-congregational structures, can allow for top-heavy and leaders who don't aspire or don't demonstrate to us the kinds of things that Peter talks about. Elders who are proud and not humble, or people who rail against the leaders that God has given them. The helpful work of the Puritans was, for me, was getting them, was allowing them to speak into my thinking about what the church is and who the church is to be. And when the body of Christ demonstrates what it is to live in unity, in love to one another, to make decisions together, we show forth the goodness of the gospel.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And we are hearing, or we have over the last 3 or 4 years, heard of a lot of stories of abusive leadership within not congregational churches, but evangelical churches. And naturally, congregationalism does protect against that sort of leadership. And the minds, I mean, if you think about it, there's a lot of names that have been associated with congregationalism over the years. The names that come to my mind are Jonathan Edwards, John Owen, Thomas Goodwin. These are heavyweights,
Mm-hmm.
big thinkers, big thinkers into church practice. They were pastors and theologians. So that's an incredible heritage that we have as congregationalists. And sometimes I think we forget that, sometimes we get a bit intimidated, but I think we can stand up with the big boys in terms of church structure and church practice and church governance. That might be a really good point for us to wrap up our conversation. Thanks, Michael. You've been super helpful, even just for me, as I've been listening to this, to actually think into some of the history and some of the theology of congregationalism. And I think we got this under 20 minutes, so I think we can give ourselves a pat on the back. But I would encourage you, if you're listening to this or watching this, we're actually going to be regularly communicating this kind of content in this sort of way. So please tune in. This is a great way for us to vision new people and to equip people in our churches and to really get a sense of unity as we're thinking about the future of the FCC and the future of congregationalism. And so please tune in. We're going to be regularly communicating and distributing content like this. Thanks, Michael. You've been super helpful. Been really informative. So I'm really, really encouraged by you, bro.
No worries, mate. My pleasure. Always good to talk to you.
And I'm sure we'll be doing this again at some point in the future. So, thanks, guys. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.